Finance Oversight Committee on April 9th. Kim, do you need us to do anything at this point?
Minutes.
Minutes,
Yep.
okay. All right, so is there a motion to approve or correct the minutes of the March 5, 2024 Financial Oversight Committee meeting?
I move that we approve the minutes from March 5th.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Thank you. The minutes are approved. The budget overview on that.
Yeah, so good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our monthly Financial Oversight Committee meeting. Adam's going to walk through a presentation here with you tonight. You just had the slides emailed to you. We'll, of course, get those uploaded here, probably here during the meeting because Kim has them now too. But really our goal for tonight was just trying to provide an update about what we knew or what we know now as some of these variables have started to get fixed for us. And so we know SSA, we know the budget reductions that you guys have approved. We know some information on the teacher salary supplement that'll affect teacher salaries. And so I'd asked Adam to kind of prepare an overview of that for you and kind of show you current status and then some things that we'll need to continue to monitor and look at here over the next several months. So Adam's going to handle the bulk of that for us this evening, and I'll just turn it over to him from here.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. And I want to start, I know this is small, hopefully you can pull it up a little bit larger, but wanted to mention the certified budget process. This is a process that we're still in the midst of following the first publication hearing last month. A hearing to approve the certified budget will take place on April 23rd. And notice of that will be published in the Press Citizen either the 12th or 13th. I haven't gotten confirmation from them on which day yet. But as you can see here, I've circled the final total levy rate, which is that 16.81854 number. That's, if you recall, it's about 2.5 cents lower than the max rate that we had brought to you last month. So there are a few adjustments once we put in the SSA rate of 2.5% that was approved instead of the 3. That had a little bit of an impact, and then we also dropped the management levy just a little bit as well due to some changes in calculation of need there. So all of that information, like I said, will be published here in the coming days and then brought to you on the 23rd. I do want to pause here. Any questions about certified budget? And if anyone is curious about that, it is roughly a 54-cent increase compared to last year. So
That's in the levy rate, is that?
correct, yep. As Superintendent Degner shared, we do now have some pieces of information that we didn't have previously, and so I want to touch on those a little bit. The supplemental state aid rate was set at 2.5%. For a while, we were thinking that was going to end up at 3. Obviously, it ended up a little bit lower than that. And just to make sure that everyone's clear and on the same page on that, that 2.5% is an increase to the general fund authority that we are granted, and includes per pupil categoricals. So things like teacher leadership funding, for example, are impacted at 2.5% as well. That is not automatic. That's something, and this is relevant for later, but that's something that can be varied by the legislature. Those rates are actually set separately, but typically they are set at the same rate. So that's something to keep in mind. The SSA rate doesn't have any impact on some of the non-general fund funds, and I'll go into some detail on that here in a little bit as well. That 2.5% translates to about a 2% increase in our authority. The reason that those numbers are different is because our enrollment is different. So our enrollment dropped by 61 students this year. Next year's budget is calculated based upon this year's enrollment. And so that decrease of 61 students essentially costs us in percentage terms about 0.5% of the budget, yeah.
Adam, what date is the enrollment set on?
It is the first school day in October. So typically it's the first, but between the 1st and 4th. Yep. There have been some bills that discuss potentially having a dual count date with a weighted first and second, but none of those have advanced. The other thing that we do have more information about now is the minimum teacher salary requirements and also the teacher salary supplement amount. So with that minimum teacher salary for 24-25 set at $47,500 and then set at $50,000 for the following year, one of the areas that we had a lot of uncertainty about was how that was going to be funded and what form that was going to take, what level that was going to be. We now know that based upon this legislation, our teacher salary supplement, which is categorical that's used to pay teacher salaries, it is what it sounds like, will be increased by $1.02 million. Reason I say related to legislation is that TSS amount also increases by the 2.5% that SSA increases. So pulling out that 2.5% amount, we're left with the just over $1 million that's related to the minimum teacher salary legislation. I do expect that there will be another additional amount next year, so that's something for us to pay attention to. And one of the things that we did get confirmation on is that this should be sustained through future SSA increases. So every now and then we'll see the state do something where they add an amount, but then they stipulate that that's not going to be included in the base when SSA increase is calculated for the following year. This should increase along with SSA in future years, so that makes it a sustainable funding source.
So that, are we going to see how much our teachers benefited from this state mandated increase?
Yeah, we will be able to articulate that. Right now, we're still working through what the models look like for reaching that and for adjusting the salary schedule. So we don't have the specific number, but once we have that and once we've gone through the negotiations process, we'll be able to say exactly what that is.
Thank you.
Yep. Quickly, I did want to touch upon unspent balance projections with the actions that you took last month, along with some that we still anticipate. For example, the reductions that we expect for FY26. These are the unspent balance projections from FY24, which is current year, through FY29. As you can see, if you look at the top number is the actual unspent balance number, and then the bottom number is the percentage of authority. For this year, we're at 0.1%. That's roughly where we've been. Usually that number has been, depending upon the data that we have at the time, between that 50,000 and 450,000 range. So not ideal, obviously. That's the reason we're involved in the budget reductions we're involved in right now. But that's what we are showing for this current year. That number increases pretty substantially, and this is tied to the reductions that we're putting in place for FY25. So for FY25, we see that number jump to 2.3 million, 1.2%. And the percentage is the number I'd really kind of want to draw your attention to, because that's the one that a couple of months ago or a few months ago, you did set the target for that being between 5 and 10%. So our current forecast does show us reaching that in FY28 at that 5.5%, with a slight increase to FY29. One thing that I just want to make clear is that this unspent balance number is cumulative. So for example, when you look at FY28 and it's 11.7 million, doesn't mean we have 11.7 million extra dollars to spend. Because if you look at FY29, even though, we're at a point where, per our guidelines, we are healthy at that point, the unspent balance only increases $700,000 between 28 and 29, which means that we are spending very close to our authority for those years without the carryover into the years. So that's just something to be aware of. I did want to share a few assumptions. These are some that I've mentioned before. I just want to make sure that they're clear, because these are numbers that can change. So this forecast assumes 2.5% SSA every year. That's what we had recommended to us by a number of different groups that we work with at the state level. And that's what we had for all 5 years of the forecast, except for that period of time where we briefly adjusted it to 3% this year when we thought that might happen. But it's assumed to be at 22.5% through FY29. Obviously not guaranteed. That's certainly something that we could see change. So, as more information becomes available, revenue estimating conference numbers come into the state, and we're starting to hear that might be higher or lower. Obviously, we'll adjust at that point. As I mentioned, these projections do include all recent board actions and future items that have been shared and discussed by the board. So everything that we've talked about is built into these, including that, at this point, kind of generic reduction for FY26. The forecast does assume slight annual enrollment declines. If we see more dramatic declines, if we see an increase, that will impact where the forecast goes. So another factor to keep in mind, but with the implementation of the ESAs, at least for the next couple of years, I feel pretty comfortable about forecasting a slight decline there.
What per year decline are you using in your forecast?
Yep, so the per year decline is a percentage basis,
Yep.
and it is, I want to say it's 0.2% or 0.3%. It's right around the ballpark of about half of what our decline was this year. So each year it translates, if I'm doing my math correctly.
Compounding on.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And I can get that specific for you. I just don't have it right offhand. So assuming annual enrollment declines, slight ones, it also assumes stable miscellaneous income. That's the other one that I mentioned that can fluctuate substantially and directly impacts our budget authority. Miscellaneous income can be wildly variable. It can also be very predictable. One of the good things we have in terms of our recent reduction to miscellaneous income due to the offloading of ESSER is that at this point, most of what accounts for our miscellaneous income is pretty predictable. It's federal title funds, it's other grants that we know we will have access to for years to come. It's certain taxes that are labeled as miscellaneous income. So, for example, mobile home taxes come in that way, and so these are things that we know are pretty stable and we can rely on. I can't imagine a scenario where we would see our miscellaneous income number drop substantially. Really, there's probably more upside variability there. So, for example, the therapeutic classroom grant that we have this year was a $997,000, I think, dollar increase to our miscellaneous income for this year. Obviously, when we get a grant like that, it's tied to spending it on something, right? So it's not just, again, extra money, but at the same time, I think there's more upside to that number than there is downside. And then the final thing that I want to mention is that this forecast, and I've worked on ways to include it, but I just don't feel like we have enough information at this point. Our team doesn't feel that way. So it does not include cost impacts for the AEA funding changes. And that's really tied to the fact that we don't want to start, earmarking and spending money when we, simply don't have enough information about what services are still going to be provided by the AEAs, what we are going to need to pick up, that sort of thing. So I'll pause for a second. Any questions? Yeah.
As our unspent balance continues to grow, do we invest it in any way?
Yeah, good question. So we do have a limited ability to invest. We can only invest in certain investment mechanisms. We typically invest our money with an organization called ICEJIT, which is an Iowa school. It's actually an Iowa public finance investment entity. And so that allows us to invest, but also to pull money out of those investments kind of on an on-demand basis. And it gets us a fairly high rate. So right now the rate that we get is about 5.04%, which is pretty comparable to a medium-length CD. We also do have the ability to invest in CDs, and we do that, but we do it less with the general fund because we expect to need those dollars pretty quickly. Or the possibility that we would. We use CDs pretty heavily as it relates to investing our capital funds, our insurance funds, things like that, where we don't expect to have to tap those. Yeah.
Any other questions for Adam?
Just for a size impact piece on the last quote that I was talking about with the AEA funding changes between our media and ed service dollars, we think that's about a $3 million allocation that's been flowing through to the AEA. You probably recall that the first year, 40% of that will still flow through the AEA, so roughly 1.2 million. That would leave 1.8 million with the district, but that's what Adam's saying. Until we really know what that 40% provides and what we might need to commit additional funds to, we're hesitant to account for any of that in our projections to know. So, but just to give you a frame of reference about how big of a pot of money we're talking about, that's roughly what it is.
Yep. I want to mention a few things related to how we're monitoring our budget reduction implementation.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
On the previous slide,
Yep.
unspent balances. Is it reasonably accurate for me to say now that our budget reductions, the purpose of our budget reductions for this year and even last year is to maintain a percent of unspent, percent of authority percentage that the state, if not actually requiring, certainly recommends? I mean, that's two questions.
I think it's
Yeah.
fair, Charlie. I think that there's a reason they recommend or require that, right? I think that's the other piece I would add with it is that there's a reason it's a recommended best practice. I mean, the variables that Adam just talked through about if we see a larger fluctuation in enrollment or if you'd see a 0% come to the district in 1 year, those were some of the things we talked about initially with making these reductions, that we'd have zero capacity right now to deal with a 0% SSA, right? We would be just cutting things very quickly or having to do midstream cuts that are very drastic to the system. So again, trying to build up that percent of authority or your projected unspent balance gives you better flexibility should you hit those unexpected events. And then there's of course a tipping point too where you don't want that to be too large either, right? We've all seen examples of that where that war chest, for example, is too large in school districts and they're not investing it close enough to the students. And so that's why the recommended balance is where it's at. Sometimes larger districts honestly can get away running a little bit smaller number than sometimes the smaller districts can. But so that was a lot to answer your question, I guess. But
well, I guess the other part of my question is getting the unspent balance is the measure of why we're doing budget reductions. Is that fair or not?
it's probably and Adam can jump in here too with a different perspective. And in my opinion, it's one of the most critical in looking at your financial health, right? And so it's a large indicator. It's not the only indicator. You know, there's other ones that we would talk to you about, but I think it's the largest indicator that they monitor and hold us accountable to. You know that we've been working with the school budget review committee this year, and it's primarily based on that healthy number and knowing if it's in a healthy spot or not. And of course, when it goes negative, that's when the additional actions from the state kick in. And so it's for sure has to be positive.
So it has to be positive.
Has to be positive. If it's not, then that's where you get an additional level of state intervention. But then after that, it's really best practice about where they monitor that.
If we, this is just my own ignorance and just double checking my own thoughts. Let's say we came into next fall and our enrollment's down 400. Does that protected balance? That's what I want. These are the variables. But I mean, let's just
We've got
say.
bigger problems with 400 kids as well.
So if we're down
Millions of
400-ish, it's going to change
Oh.
what we would expect a $2.5 million cut next year to be to a much larger cut, right? And so it would probably force us, I would say, into some situation that we would again look for midstream cuts to make in the middle of next year. You know, we would start trying to reduce expenses right away, but for sure that fiscal year 26 planning, that question would be changed dramatically.
So how much is it per student in SSA right now?
Roughly 75.
Yeah, it's right around 7,500. I don't have the specific number offhand for this year.
I would put every 133 students is roughly $1 million.
Yeah.
Just put it in.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, if they use a voucher, you get it back. I mean, it's not,
Yeah.
but
No,
it's
I want
simple,
it.
but-
It's,
Yeah.
These are why we have.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
So another thing that I will point out, and the district has only used it once that I'm aware of, is Iowa does have something called the budget guarantee, which districts with substantially declining enrollment use on a regular basis. And essentially what that does is it tries to protect you against a catastrophic decline in funding due to enrollment loss. So essentially what it says is that for 1 year, you are protected such that your authority will not drop lower than what it was last year. And I think it's actually what it was last year plus like 1%. Yeah. And so if we had something like a massive, 400 student decline,
That's what happened during the pandemic.
we would hit that budget guarantee, which means that our authority would actually be higher than what would be calculated based upon SSA. We would have to levy that additional amount in property tax to get there. And then it's only 1 year. And so then that following year, even if we had another decline, then we would go down to what our authority would have been for the previous year plus 1%. So it's kind of stair-stepped. And so there's a little protection against just a sudden hit like that.
Yeah, we used it probably 5 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was right after COVID.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right with 2020 when we hit that 285 student.
140 school districts are on it, projected for next year.
Yeah.
It's about 43%.
Yeah, and the lower SSA is, the
Yeah.
more there are. And actually, in a way, it's kind of a protection against something like 0% SSA, because that almost guarantees that almost everybody is going to be on the budget guarantee and still get that 1%.
Now, just to follow up with Mitch's interesting observation here. We don't have, as I understand it, we don't have any information in terms of projecting a trend at this point in time that would suggest a 1 year enrollment decline at that magnitude.
No, we do not. And we operate on a 2-year schedule with professional demographers' reports for enrollment projections. Next fall is when we are scheduled to do that again. And so that'll be after 2 years of data from implementation of the vouchers. It'll also be, at that point, 5-6 years past COVID. And so hopefully that will be a projection report that can take into account some of the more important factors that the last report, just based upon timing, simply couldn't. Because ideally, like I said, I'm projecting a slight enrollment decline over these years. I'm not a big fan of using a number that I look at and say, I think this is the best way to project. I'd much rather that be a number generated by professionals who do that work. But the reality is, because of the changing factors, the ball game changed too much from when we got the last data for the last enrollment projections, but we will get that again in the fall.
Other questions?
All right, I won't spend much time on this. I'd encourage you, though, if you do want to learn more, please ask or reach out. There are a few areas that we're working on or we're already implementing as it relates to budget reduction implementation monitoring. Whenever you reduce budgets, it's important that you make sure that you're doing so in a way that's implemented with fidelity, in a way that's constantly monitored as you change a system for what changes are more destructive than we expected, where do we see additional opportunities we didn't previously realize, et cetera. So we're currently already have done some of this, but working on real-time financial dashboarding, which is something the district has never really utilized, but the ability to look at dashboards that are fed by the actual revenue and expenditures that are coming in on a daily or weekly basis. So that I think is important in terms of being able to quickly identify issues or positive trends. Financial reporting and analysis more broadly. This is something that I wish I could snap my fingers and just have this developed exactly where I want it to be, but in terms of whether it's reporting that goes to you, whether it's internal reporting within my department and my team, or within our executive team here, whatever the case, those are reports that I'm trying to continue to add data to that's important and requested, and ultimately again have as close of an idea, as good of an idea, and be able to share that with others of what our financial reality is. Ideally we're never in a situation where something catches us by surprise, and so ultimately that's the goal with some of the work that we're doing to develop our reporting abilities there, and the report products themselves. departmental reviews. One of the things that, I think is critical is to acknowledge in a system of our size, there is no one person who monitors all of our expenditures. There's no one person who can have that level of control. And so ultimately, to me, it's regular discussions with, and then also working to, again, develop and implement the tools and the training to empower our department leaders, our building leaders, to understand what the budget reality is for the part of the budget that they work with, and be able to, again, at all levels of the organization, have a clear understanding of what's happening with our financial resources. That's something I think is critical. So again, something we're working on here to develop. Benchmarking is another one. This one you've already seen some of what we've tried to add when we were working on, for example, looking at whether it's peer district comparisons across schools of staffing costs, things like that. But the ability to engage in whether it's year-to-year comparisons, within district comparisons, cross-district comparisons, to look at, again, both where we need to make adjustments and where we maybe have some opportunities to leverage. And then along with all of this, those things are unimportant if you're not willing to engage in continuous evaluation and improvement. So that's something I've been proud, I think, of the work that we have done so far to, diagnose an issue. We have our initial ideas about it, but then there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of collaboration that's happened to determine what are the next steps. And sometimes the initial ideas change, and that's a good thing. So as we, again, work through the budget reductions, monitoring not only the financial reality, but also the reality in terms of the experience of our students and our teachers and our staff and our public, identifying, this change we thought wasn't going to be as disruptive as it is, and it is, so let's revisit that change. I think those are important factors. And then also just along with that, the flexibility to respond, whether it's to new inputs from our side, whether it's to changing legislation. So for example, I mentioned our budget forecast doesn't take into account the AEA funding transition. That's a pretty big thing to not take into account. But at the same time, we don't want to guess, but we also want to make sure that we're in a position that we have an understanding of the range of implications so that as soon as we have all the data that we need, we can incorporate that and understand what the impact is going to be. So those are just some areas I wanted to share that have been important in terms of the work that I'm doing, and I think will strengthen us going forward. I'll pause. Any questions about any of that?
Just going back on that point you made about the clear understanding, I think, in terms of involving the board in these discussions and, just to optimize what happens here at this financial oversight meeting, it would be ideal if we got these slides 48 hours prior to the meeting so that we can kind of review them and marinate on them and come up with more questions as needed. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Now, also, I'm interested in if we can expect over the course of this year, periodic and fairly frequent summaries or information from you and Matt about the financial reporting analysis and the continuous evaluation of here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would help a lot if we do that on a frequent, repetitive basis. And so I have to hear this stuff about 10 times before I understand a single aspect of it.
That's fair. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're hoping to be able to facilitate through these meetings, and then certainly also through some of those regular reports, the quarterly financial report coming up. I think our next board meeting. But then not only just having those, but also bolstering what information we are including in those and making them as usable and readable as possible, so that they're clear, hopefully. And as you have feedback about those things, please do share, and we'll try to improve them.
Any questions?
All right. I don't want to spend much time on this. I do want to mention the existence of different funds to a certain extent to make sure that some of the context is clear in terms of what we're doing in terms of our budget reductions. But this graphic, some of you have probably seen before. It's got these cool buckets for each. Basically, this is how our budget is broken up. And these are different funding sources. And the way Iowa law works, there is very little opportunity for there to be any interaction between these different funds. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all of the details here. The general fund is the one that we're talking about the most. That is the fund that funds the general operations of the school district, funded through property taxes, as the certified budget process makes clear, through state aid, and then also that miscellaneous income item. There are a number of other funds that are relevant here, and I'm actually going to talk about them in greater detail on this next slide in terms of some specific items. So the management fund pays primarily for activities that are associated with the district taking on risk. So whether that's paying for insurance, early retirement benefits, arbitration, mediation, and then cybersecurity is the one that I wanted to focus on a little bit. Over the past few years, we've had an increase in our costs related to cybersecurity. Those costs have primarily come out of our capital funding sources, and some have come out of our general fund related to training. There has been some movement by the Department of Ed to acknowledge that certain cybersecurity related costs beyond cybersecurity liability insurance are also eligible for expenditure out of the management fund. So that's one example of an area that we look at that management fund, which is one of the few that has no real limit. That's not to say we want that to just float up to whatever, but at the same time, there is no cap in Iowa code as far as how much you can spend from your management fund. So that's an area that we'll look to leverage, especially as we do have some indication that cybersecurity ability to spend on that may grow. Student Activity Fund is primarily where we fund our co-curricular, extracurricular activities, athletics, or clubs, and that's generally, fundraising and student fees that are funding that. I did toss tickets in as a highlighted item as just an area that, you have to be careful with. So as we look at, any need to raise revenue on that activity fund side, there are trade-offs as it relates to establishing ticket prices, that sort of thing. That's something that's always come before the board right around April or May of each year, and so it's another thing that will come before the board in terms of the overall student fees that we set. The capital sales tax fund, which is SAVE, and then the physical plant and equipment fund, both can be used for basically the same things. In fact, any PEPAL purpose for SAVE. SAVE is restricted by our revenue purpose statement, which is written such that we can spend it for most PEPAL purposes. But at the same time, that's an area that we've been working to shift some general fund costs into those capital funds. Again, because they're not restricted in the same way. And so that allows us to do some work. Not going to spend a lot of time on debt service or enterprise. Debt service pays for our principal and interest payments on debt. And then enterprise funds, for our purposes, primarily we're talking about food service. That is an area where we have a healthy fund balance. And so again, it's one that we're looking at where those allowable opportunities are to shift some of our general fund expenditures into the nutrition fund. And then the only other thing I wanted to share at this meeting is the use of categoricals. And the thing I want to draw your attention to on this, first of all, is that these are not all the categoricals that exist in the state. There are about 70. But these are some that I identified as either large or of particular importance to our budget reductions. And a lot of that relates to flexible use. So if you look at that bottom row, for example, the homeschool assistance program, funding purpose is programming for homeschooled students enrolled with partial enrollment. When COVID happened, our HSAP program exploded, as did the funding then the following year. Almost as soon as it grew, it declined. And so the homeschool assistance program has carried a large fund balance now for several years in a row. And due to recent change in state law, those carryover balances may be transferred to what's called a flex fund that can then be used for other general fund purposes with a public hearing. That's true as well for the TQ fund, which is Teacher Quality Professional Development, as well as the TLC, Teacher Leadership and Compensation Fund, although that one can also be done without a public hearing or board action if it goes to teacher salary supplement. But either way, the reason I wanted to mention those is that that's something we have mentioned in terms of those categorical transfers to the general fund. It's kind of a one-time relief for the general fund. That's something I have mentioned, and I would expect we'll have a public hearing on the one of the board meetings in May. So something to be aware of there. Any questions?
So Adam, the balance in all of these special purpose funds
Yep.
or categorical funds, it goes into making up the balance in the unspent balance, is that, that's too simple?
It's a little bit too simple. So the categorical funds do increase our funding authority, but only to the extent that we actually spend those dollars. So I'll give you an example. If we receive $5 million in TLC, Teacher Leadership Program funding, but we only spend $4 million, then the increase in authority is $4 million, not the 5. That extra million is still there. It carries over to the next year, but it didn't impact our authority. The reason that this flexibility transfer is useful is, let's say that we've achieved what we feel we need to achieve with that $4 million spend. Then we can take that additional $1 million, transfer it to a flex fund, and then that flex fund can be used for any general fund purpose, which means that now we get to use that extra $1 million of authority that would have just carried over to next year, and we wouldn't have had that this year. We get to use that, which adds to our authority. Presumably we're using it to offset costs that are already incurred out of the general fund. And so these funds increase our authority, but the carryover amounts don't, if that makes sense.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
But that's not your fault. Any other questions? Okay.
All right, that's all I had.
I like the bucket graphic.
Thanks to Kristen for that.
Just to reiterate, the only thing, the only fund that can pay for salaries and employees is the general fund. Unless it's some of these other little ones that you shuffle in.
Yeah, there are a few absolutes in Iowa law as it relates to school funding.
Yeah,
So for example, we pay a certain portion of certain physical plant and technology employees' salaries out of capital funds associated with our implementation of the facilities master plan, which is allowable, but it's a very limited allowance. So the enterprise funds, nutrition, for example, pays for quite a bit of salary cost. The capital funds can pay for a tiny amount. For the most part, though, it's correct that the vast majority of our employees, we can only pay for their salaries out of the general fund.
When Adam said it's hard to talk about in absolutes, I always try to talk about it in terms of concepts, right? Like that 86 cents of the dollar, when you think about that, that's mostly going to staff salaries, to just give people some perspective on like the size of the percentage of the budget that's going to those salaries, because he's absolutely right that, you know, trying to talk in those specifics, you know, they can catch in the argument. So just from a conceptual standpoint, to get people to understand that most of that general fund part of the budget goes to salaries, right? There are some other isolated things with those categoricals and examples he gave you.
And to follow up, it seems to me that making more funds available for salaries and compensation, which are mainly out of our general fund, making more funds available that are not general, do not start out as general fund, is a good thing to do.
Yes, to whatever extent we can. And so, yeah. Yeah.
And that to whatever extent we can, school boards have to rely upon staff to make those decisions.
Generally, yes, although if you come up with ideas, feel free to shoot them my way.
Well,
Yeah.
people in the public that have ideas.
Yep. Yeah, and in general, like I said, in general, the vast majority of our staff can only be paid out of the general fund. There are only certain groups that may be able to be paid out of others. The really big one, though, is nutrition. That's a group that's almost entirely paid out of non-general fund sources.
And those non-sources are federal sources, right?
It's the nutrition fund, which is primarily federal funding, but it also includes the sales for food services, students paying for, families paying for lunch, a la carte, et cetera. And then it includes some state funding sources as well.
COVID was actually really good for our nutrition fund.
Yeah.
Because we got to have the federal rebate for every single student, so we built up a pretty considerable balance in that fund that's allowed Allison to do some nice things to help improve our nutrition services program.
Thanks. Are there any other questions at this point? Or comments?
I actually,
Wow.
I have a comment, Charlie. I just want to say, I mean, I'll say it probably tonight too, but in full board meeting when it's, video and everything, but I just want to say thanks to Adam for all the work. I mean, I sort of give Adam a hard time sometimes. He picked the perfect first year. There you see, but basically considerable amount of work to put in the systems, not only to manage all of just this data and the changes that are happening, but then to put the systems in place that are going to then support us moving forward in the future. That is very impressive. So
Thank you.
And as I understand it, Brady, then the Education Association, all of its members, and everyone else who's an employee has access to this same information. So we're not disguising anything in terms of available.
yeah, I mean, it's public information. It's not. That's the thing I would say is compiling it into that level of detail with understandability it's not easy. I mean, it is public data, but having that access, it's tricky to get. Most places don't. Most districts don't have that level of transparency. They just don't.
Yeah, we can all pull up this spreadsheet
Yeah.
with a million numbers on it, but then parse that out. I mean, that's what I appreciate, this sort of continual improvement in how it's communicated. And as somebody who's been looking at this for a long time, I think I have a pretty good understanding of it. All of this is helping conceptualize it further. Because those big spreadsheets with all the numbers are public, but to dig into that and pull it out and understand what it means, and also I appreciate, Adam, that we are paying more things out of category funds when we can. I mean, that's a big piece of what we're doing in this budget process, is trying to correctly identify where funds should belong, and that just helps our general fund.
And Charlie, Matt probably won't toot his own horn, but from an employee perspective, one of the things Matt started doing 18 months ago or 12 months ago was doing these video snippets about the budget and to the staff, and I think those were a game changer for the staff because people didn't have to pull out a spreadsheet or look at it, and that's a credit to Adam and also Matt for doing a different approach on that, because it really did help us be able to digest it better from the employee base.
Oh, great.
I might remember a time when maybe HR couldn't get straight information from our finance, and it was a challenge.
Yeah.
And it made it really difficult bargaining table when it wasn't just not transparency, it was like obstruction.
Yeah. Because then neither side could.
The policy change or policy decision made on the part of HR.
Yeah.
So
Leadership.
it's like a personnel change.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wasn't here, so it's.
Thanks.
Yep. I mean, not to throw.
Plead the fifth on that one.
Yeah, it's before most people.
Again,
I know not everybody.
it's just to emphasize this continual improvement for transparency, for better understanding, and that it hasn't always been that way. I think, so not to get into all that stone throwing, but it's just it's getting better, and I think even it's getting better, and then it's a lot easier for us to operate, and it's not easy to make difficult decisions, but at least we know the information that we're making them on, and we can make more accurate. I mean, and I would say just every year it's gotten better. I was impressed with all the stuff that was happening before. The color-coded spreadsheet that compares us to other districts, that's when I tout quite a bit, and it just keeps getting better and more understandable, so it helps boards make those
And it occurs to me after listening to the messages and comments from people in the public that, Iowa funding of their school systems is a very complicated process. And we could offer an adult course with classes every day.
In fact, IASB has a 100, 200, and 300.
IASB does a really good job.
We do,
Yep.
We have them for teachers too, through ISBA.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? So the next item on the agenda is setting our next meeting. Do we do this? So, do we have a schedule we're supposed to be following here?
Well, the next recurring one would be in May. I think in May, we probably want to entertain if we want that to be an operations meeting or a finance meeting. We haven't had operations in a while, and there's a couple items that we should probably take in operations. So if you're okay, I think I'd like to say to be determined until as a team we can kind of talk about if we want to do that as a finance or an operations meeting. There might be a compelling reason to do finance or something even related to negotiations in that time slot, but right now, Charlie, I think that would actually fall for May 14th.
Yeah.
14th would be the regular time, and so at 5 o'clock would be when we would typically do it, but if it's okay, we can leave it TBD and then determine if that's going to be the next one or not.
The operations committee reports. Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
All right, so we're ready to adjourn? Just have a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Second.
Ruthie
Second that.
and Jane second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.